anyhow, we're going to record. What we'll do is go through the PowerPoints that they provided, and after that, there are labs for these things. The first one it's kind of interesting because you're going to install a Trojan. The first one's after the second unit. The first unit, security controls, and I jump around a lot, as you'll probably know, as some of you guys already know. But the first part, security controls, is not part of the specific objectives of the certification, but it's still something that you need to know. It's kind of a background, and it is the things that you need to know its background. I'm stumbling because I'm trying to see if everybody's here. It looks like Clyde Blewett. He should be in Dallas. Is anybody in Dallas know him, see him? Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and try to submit the attendance. Anyhow, the controls, and controls can mean a lot of things, and you guys that have experience know what controls are, and especially in the military, all sorts of controls, what you can and can't do. But anyhow, in this one, the objectives: understand why security policies and procedures are critical to protecting assets, and we all have policies and procedures of some sort. Policies after policy after policy. Again, for those of you who are or have been in the military, all sorts of policies there, what you can and can't do. Distinguish the types of security controls that can be deployed to protect assets, and that's really what we're trying to do in these things, in this thing, the security thing, is to protect assets, and there are lots of different assets that we need to protect. And you have to be reasonable about it, because you don't want to spend $10,000 to protect a $50 item, for instance. Describe the basis of access control systems, identification, authentication, authorization, and accounting, and based on a lot of the background that you guys already have, you know where a lot of that's coming from. And know the use of different access control models. So in this thing, and these go right through the book, and the page number for the slide is down here on the lower right hand corner. So this slide would be the material on page 3 of the book. So when we talk about these things, and people and organizations, and most of us do fear crime, particularly violent crime, but organizations fear crime for a number of reasons: loss of assets, loss of reputation if somebody hacks you, or they can have some real legal liability if somebody steals credit information or personal information, personal identifiable information. Security Plus, as well as I heard somebody say ethical hacker, don't really teach you to hack. Ethical hacker doesn't teach you to hack either. What we want to do is look at some of the tools that hackers use and use them for ourselves, and learn how to protect ourselves from those tools. So increasing computer crime, any crime committed with a computer is considered a cyber crime. And hackers and crackers, hackers has got to be a dirty word. And hacker in its real sense are people that have a lot of knowledge and want to share the knowledge and want to learn. Crackers are the guys that are the bad guys. They're the criminal hackers. So they're out to steal something, or to do something nasty, or steal your information, sometimes just to be a pain. And then we have a fraud. They call them a fraudster. They may use a fake web store to steal credit card details or things like that. And there's a number of those things with redirects that go on, and as we'll see later on, some of that's not really all that difficult to do. Some of it's not as easy as they always make out on television. But what we want to do is protect ourselves from those people. And then vandalism. Some people just want to be destructive. And I think probably a lot of that would be disgruntled former employees may want to be destructive, or somebody thinks they have a vendetta against an organization. And as we all know, more and more and more use of the Internet. The Internet's become really, I mean, we can do something like this, which you couldn't have done just a few years ago for the bandwidth, the software, the computers weren't powerful enough to do this primarily, but more and more and more use of the Internet, and many of them don't have effective policies. What can users do? What can users not do? What's considered appropriate use of the Internet assets that the company has? How are you going to keep people from stealing information that they shouldn't? It used to be more difficult to do that. There was some exfiltration through emails or something like that, but in today's world, unless you have your policies right, somebody can come in with a flash drive and plug it in and put an awful lot of information on a flash drive and walk out of the door with it. So policies, what are the policies going to be for the different devices, the different uses of devices? How much information are you going to allow users to have? What are they going to be able to, what resources are they going to be able to access? And that's where policies come in. And they say it's more than locks, antivirus, and firewalls, and a lot of it is training. But we usually think about securities. We're going to set up a firewall. We're going to do this. We're going to do that. All of the technical sort of uses of these things. But really effective security is about people and operations as much about that as it is technology. And most of, probably, I don't know, I'm going to say almost 100% of the recent intrusions have been through people giving up information that they shouldn't have. I don't remember which one it was, because as you get old you forget stuff, but one of the recent hacks where they stole a bunch of personal information came through the air conditioning system, because people have put environmental controls on the Internet. So, well, advantage is you can monitor them. It gives you a stream of what they do. And somebody had given up their credentials, and they got onto the environmental controls, and then from the environmental controls they moved on to getting onto the network. And when you do hackers, and when you guys do ethical hacker, the first thing is to get a foothold. Once you get a foothold, then you elevate your privileges, and from there you go on to do nasty things to the company. So what we're trying to protect are assets, tangible and intangible, people. And assets have some sort of value. All assets have a value of some kind. It could be something that you can put dollars and cents on. It could be something that the intangible, your reputation, when we do these things. So intangible, intellectual property, accounting information, designs. This is another one. I know I got a lot of stories, but a few years ago, one of these gaming companies got their game stolen before it was released, and it got stolen through the CEO's laptop, desktop, his computer that was there with him. So when we do security, the people that sometimes are the worst about it are the people that are in control, and they frequently don't want to comply. It's one of those things that doesn't apply to them, applies to everybody else. And to talk about people, and people are assets, and people are assets that sometimes we don't think of them that way. They are what makes the business, and that's what this is about, is protecting those assets. And that can be, and somebody said bad weather in Dallas again, which means it'll probably be here tomorrow night, but those are the kinds of things that you have to protect against too. The different things that may happen to your network, and we'll get into some of those things. And so we talk about assets have value, and market value, practical value, and then liabilities that they possess. And liabilities, if something happens that we don't want to happen, we may have some issues with that. And they say in their book, assets must be valued according to the liabilities that a loss or damage of the asset would create. Then we talk about business continuity. And business continuity is more than just backing up the server. Business continuity is the ability to keep the business going in the face of a disaster. What I like to say is business continuity is you don't come to work and the server crashed and golly, you got to restore from backup. You come to work one morning and the building's not there anymore. Can the business survive? And that's what business continuity is really about, is how much can you do to keep the business going. And there are a lot of statistics about that, and I'll throw one out that is close, that businesses that lose all of that information, like 80% of them are out of business within a year if they can't get it back, if they don't have a business continuity plan, and that is all part of security also. And then we have the legal ramifications, civil and criminal. If you haven't been doing proper protection, proper procedures, there can be criminal charges in these things. Civil liability is pretty common in most of the incursions, and we'll probably have somebody on TV a little bit, if you ever, whatever, give us a call. And then the professional standards and codes, are we meeting the professional standards? There's lots of guidance available. NIST has guidance, FBI has guidance, CIA has guidance, and you can get a lot of documents, checklists, step-by-step procedures to allow you to do the policies, set up your network in a hopefully in a manner that you're not going to get into some of these troubles with. Data. Why is data important? I don't know that we really need to discuss that one a whole lot, but the data is what the company is. Without the data, the company doesn't exist. It can be essential for a lot of things, IT administration, obviously, product development, sales, marketing, financial information, all sorts of things are there to be protected and hopefully not be stolen. And then the legal, regulatory, contractual obligations, those come up again and again and again. The legal requirements, the regulatory requirements, contractual obligations that you may have with other people. And we get into privacy policies. What are you going to do with the data that you collect over the internet? And you need to tell people what's going on there. And you need to comply with your own policies, because if you lose data and you haven't complied with your own policies, that's one of the things that's going to be not fun. Talk about the CIA Triad, and this is not the Central Intelligence Agency, but confidentiality, integrity, and availability. If we have data, and we said data is important, it's got to be stored some way. Paper, we all are trying to stay away from paper, but if we have paper, people then want to scan it and have it electronic and have it electronically searchable. So if we have data and it's stored electronically and we have data on paper, they're all at risk. Paper can be stolen, fire can be burned. Electronically, we need to protect the data and ensure that it is that it hadn't been changed, modified, that there hadn't been any modification. And there's two types of data. One is, I think I call it at rest, and the other one is in motion. So at rest is stored on a disk or a tape or a flash drive or a whatever device. And then the transmitted data is data in motion that's going across a network. And each of these different methods of electronically storing these things is going to require different kinds of protections. We want to secure it, and the secure information properties are confidentiality, integrity, and availability, and down there in parentheses, non-repudiation. Non-repudiation kind of becomes a side effect of these things. Confidentiality obviously is that only the user that the data is intended for can see the data, use the data, interpret the data. Integrity means that what we sent was what actually got there, that something wasn't changed en route, or if it's being stored, that something wasn't changed while it was in storage. Availability means that the people, the users that should be able to access the data can actually access it. Can you get to the website? And that's where denial of service attacks come in. We can sometimes do our own. Did somebody trip over the cord to the server? Those kinds of things. That becomes an availability issue. We become our own denial of service agent. And then non-repudiation. Non-repudiation means that you can't deny that you did something, that you sent something. You can't deny that you sent an email. Those are all things that we need to be able to do in the security world. Security policies, and I'm sure that everybody's had policies, been part of policies, sometimes been a victim of a policy. Well, for a security policy, the first thing you got to have is buy-in. You got to have buy-in starting at the top. The people at the top of the organization have to be part of this, because if we don't have their buy-in, then it doesn't do any good for you or me to come up with a policy if it's not going to be enforced. And if you have a policy, there really needs to be some sort of enforcement. And enforcement means that there's some sort of a repercussion for not doing those things. And then we talk about risk assessment. And risk assessment, what are our risks? What can we do to prevent it? What's the probability that any of this stuff is going to happen to us? So all of these things have to be done in order to do that. I'm going to look at the bullets that they have in your book. The first step is support and commitment. That's the buy-in. The next step, we have to analyze the risks to security within the organization. Any components, processes, situations that could lead to a loss is going to be a risk. Once we've identified the risks, we need to set up some sort of controls in order to mitigate those risks. Is that talking about tested, documented procedures and security controls? What do we need to do? Detect and prevent loss, enable recovery from loss. And detect and prevent loss is what are the weaknesses? What could happen to us? Thunderstorm, power could go out. we're going to have a loss for a few minutes. You may lose some stuff on the machine, but if lightning strikes the server and destroys the server, you're going to be able to get the data back. And had you done something to protect the server before you get there? And here, the final step for the policy is compliance. Are people complying with it? And that compliance frequently in large organizations becomes a whole area unto itself, that you have a compliance section that checks constantly that we're complying with what we say. And compliance, like many of you have had inspections in the military, what they did in the Navy anyway is come in and read your local instructions and see if you complied with them. So many of you, and I think most of you, have had inspections of some sorts in there. And then we have the roles and responsibilities. Who's going to be responsible for what? Somebody's going to be overall responsible for what's going on. Maybe the security officer, the chief, the information security officer is going to be responsible for that. Managers, managerials, specific areas of responsibility. The technical staff for implementing and maintaining the policy. A simple one is in a network is a password policy. What is your password policy? Are you going to have complex passwords? How long do the passwords have to be? How frequently are the passwords got to be changed? If and when they're changed, how long do you have to keep that password before you can make a new one? Those are things that the technical staff can configure to enforce what's going on with the system. And then the non-technical responsibility is to comply with the policies. And that's all of our responsibilities, comply with the policy. And to help other people comply with the policy, other users comply with the policy. The legal and regulatory is due care or liability. Due care is something that you need to do. Have you monitored your network? Did you set up the antivirus programs? Did you do the firewall properly configured? Did you test the firewall? Those sorts of things. Do care in order to protect information. So the security professional's role in all of this is risk assessment, testing the devices and software and how they're configured, install and configure devices, access control and user privilege, who has what permissions to get what resource, and do you monitor that? Do you check it to be sure that users haven't elevated their privileges? Do you have policies set up so that you can tell if somebody made changes? Incident reporting and response, something that we all would hate to do, but if something happens, it needs to be reported. Many companies don't want to report it. They don't want to call in law enforcement, but sometimes you have to get law enforcement involved in these things. Create and test business continuity plans. That's a simple little line there, but that's a really complex issue. And if you completely test the business continuity plan, just like when we talk about penetration testing later on, you may disrupt the company. You may actually do damage too if you test these things. If you can set up a lab environment to test them, that's the best thing. You may not want to do full-scale tests, but you need to test components of it to be sure that it works. I've been places, seen places that people made backups for years and years and years. Back up the server, back up the server, back up the server. Server crashed, and they go to restore the backup, and golly, it didn't work. When you do these things, you do need to check. You don't have to do the full, but you need to check out what's going on in these things. Countermeasures, something designed to make an asset or information secure. What are we going to do with these things? We're going to use some sorts of countermeasures. And then the control types here, families, there is a list on page 8 of the book of all of those families, the basic function of these things, and then there are further broken down into classes. Most of these come from NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and they have Federal Information Processing Standards, FIPS, and when you see FIPS, that's what they are, and what NIST is. But this is how these things are broken down: technical, operational, management, families, and then within the families, classes of what goes on with them. Physical security control types. Physical security is another way of classifying security. Physical security is probably where your security should start, because there are, for instance, you can hack a Windows server pretty quick if you can get physical access to it. You can change the password on a Cisco router in maybe 3 or 4 minutes if you can get physical access. So physical security becomes a big deal. Alarms, it is alarms, gateways, and locks, all of the things that we do. And then the administrative is the way people act, the policies, procedures, and guidance. The way people act, as well as these other things, we get into things like you have a secure door, but somebody opens the door and then another person walks in right behind them. It's called tailgating. So how do the users react to what's going on with all of these things? And the technical is in the operating system, software, hardware, those kinds of things. How do we do that? Back to the Windows server, how do you prevent that from happening? You lock it up, obviously, but you can configure the BIOS so that you can't boot to a flash drive or boot to a CD, DVD in order to do those things. So we have the technical, which are in the systems themselves, implemented in those, and other technical things be firewalls, antivirus software, operating system, access control models. How can you get into the system itself? And then we have the goals and functions of the physical security, a number of different ones. A preventive control physically or logically restricts access. So we're going to restrict access and preventive. Deterrent, we want to psychologically discourage the attacker. The detective is record attempted or successful intrusions. Corrective, we're going to respond to it and correct, and then compensating, we want to restore the function itself. Access control and access control lists in this thing, and these are the security terms: subjects, objects, and then access control lists. The subjects are the users of the software, the yous and the me's of the world that use these things. The object is the resources like the server, the data. The objects are the things that we're trying to get, and the access control list is something that grants privileges to the subjects to access the objects. And then the appropriate control: identification versus authentication versus authorization. Identification means that you really know who you're dealing with. We used to have the ability to work off campus for some users, and people would let their passwords expire, and the only way that you could renew your password or reset your password once it expired was come to campus. But they call up the network administrator and say, hey, I need you to reset my password. Well, he didn't have identification. There was no way to positively identify the individual unless they actually came in. So identification is we know who it actually is. And it can identify a user or it can identify a process. Authentication means that we prove that we are who we say we are when we log in. The identification, we're going to get a username. When we log in, we're going to use that username in order to get onto the resource. And authentication means that we put in the correct username, password, or whatever else that we may be using to authenticate. Could be a smart card, could be a username. Again, username, password is what most people are using. And then versus authorization. Authorization is what you can actually use. So if we logged into a server or a workstation, what files can we look at would be our authorization. What printers can we use would be our authorization. And then accounting or auditing is when we record what actually happened. That's the thing that we love to not do, which is to go back and look at the logs, which is where the accounting takes place. Log analysis is not a lot of fun. There are a number of tools to help you with it, but it just takes time. Identification, it says, associates a subject, user, or software process with the action performed on the network. And it's identified by the account. An identifier, a username, or a SID. I copied a SID so you can see what they look like. In a SID, and this is a Microsoft Active Directory SID. And a SID is a security identifier, and over here is a RID, which is a relative identifier. We have the domain SID, which is going to be consistent for all the users in the domain, and then the RID is going to change as we create new users. We just add numbers to it. So the identifier, username, and in the username, if you go to an Active Directory server or in any of the Microsoft servers, and you have a username, my name, you delete that username and recreate my name, it's going to be a different, even though it's got the same label, it's going to be a different user, but it's going to have a different SID. You would have to go back and give all the permissions to that user again. And the credentials that we use to authenticate users, that could be username and password, could be a lot of other things, could be biometrics, could be a fingerprint, a palm print, could be even a signature. And the signature is not just the shape of the letters, it's the speed that you do. There are a number of ways to do those things. It could be a key fob, a smart card, a number of different items that we can use to authenticate the users. The profile is the information that's stored about the user. The profile would be like your first name, last name, maybe home address, phone number, those kinds of things. And then issue and enrollments is we need identity proofing. Do we know who this user really is? And when you sign up on the internet, a lot of times they want an email address, a valid email address to do those things. Valid accounts and the CAPTCHAs that they use help us prove that we're human, because you have to type these things in. It's to prevent robots from going out and making multiple accounts to take up those areas. The secure credentials, the secure transmission of credentials, is sending the initial password securely. Needs protection against snooping and rogue administrative staff, people that shouldn't be seeing those things. Many newly created accounts have default passwords, and users need to change those default passwords. A lot of equipments come with default usernames and default passwords. Those default usernames and passwords are only designed to set up the system. Many of us in the Windows world continue to use the user administrator. And when you go back into this SID, the user administrator always ends in the same digits, and I think it's 0001, which means that somebody that gets on the system using the SID, can determine immediately who the administrator account is, whether you rename it or not. So none of those default credentials are really intended to be used forever. There's the administrator, and I'll pick on Microsoft because I've done it for a long time. The default on Microsoft Administrator is designed to set the system up, create an administrative user that complies with your naming convention, give them the permissions that they need to manage the system, and then disable the administrator's account. And then we have to compromise, revoke compromised accounts. That's sometimes, I mean, to revoke the account's pretty easy. You can just make it go away. But then you've got to go back, and after you've helped figure out why that happens, then you need to give that user back all the permissions that they use. And down here, identity management, the issues and problems that got to be overcome in implementing these things. Password resets are a pain. If you don't set up, if you have even a small organization, you can get passwords that people forget, and then they want to know what their password is. And those of you who have done Windows know that you can't tell them what it is. You can reset it for them. But what's the password reset process? And then identity management, single sign-on. Single sign-on is really good for the administrator until the single sign-on password gets compromised, and then all of the resources that that user has gets compromised. In the Microsoft world, single sign-on, we have it. It's called Active Directory. You sign on to Active Directory and you get access to all of the assets that you've been authorized to use that are in the domain. It can simplify your life and it can complicate your life. We had early on, I was a network administrator, we had an Active Directory domain, but we were running a Linux email server, which meant that people had to have two usernames and passwords, one for the email server since it wasn't part of the Active Directory, and one for the Windows system. And a lot of the non-technical folks never did figure that one out. When we went to an Exchange server, it simplified life considerably because we had single sign-on. A number of people have tried single sign-on. Microsoft did it a few years ago, and I think now you get all your Microsoft accounts through a single sign-on. Google's trying it. You get all of your Google accounts through a single sign-on. But the downside of that is if you lose that single sign-on, that you've compromised on a whole lot of information. The other thing that may happen is users use their work passwords in their non-work accounts, so that if the non-work account's compromised, then it may give somebody a step up on trying to compromise a work one. So authentication, we talked about this already, proves that a user or a process is who it or he or she claims to be. And authentication can be three different things: something you know, something you have, or something you are. Something you know, password, PIN, personal identifiable information. They talk about birthday or whatever else that somebody may ask you to in order to identify yourself, to authenticate what's going on. Something you have or are. Something you have is a smart card, a fob, one-time password, and something you are: fingerprint, face, signature, retinal scan, a number of different items for biometrics. Biometrics are becoming less expensive, but they're still not cheap. We can have single factor or multi-factor authentication. And a number of commercial entities, Google, for instance, now have multi-factor authentication. You log on to your Gmail account, and if you have multi-factor enabled, they'll send you a text message with a PIN that you have to put in before you can get into your account. A number of banks do that, and it's probably a really good idea for your banking to do that because it makes it that much more difficult for somebody to get into the account. You set up the phone number that it comes to. Of course, any of this stuff, if you're good enough, can probably be compromised. With strong authentication, 2 or 3 types of factors. And the factors have to be from the different elements, something you know, something you have, or something you are. So we can have 2-factor authentication would be maybe a smart card and a PIN would be something we have and something we know. It can't be two from the same thing. It can't be 2 somethings you know. It has to be something you know, something you have, something you know, something you are, something you have, something you are, those kinds of things. It can't be 2 somethings you have, 2 somethings you are to be multi-factor. Authorization, we've already talked about, it's granting the users, the subject, the rights to the resources, the objects. And the policy enforcement here is ensuring that only authorized rights are exercised, which means that you're going to have to audit users occasionally to see what they actually have in order to see if that policy or that enforcement has been violated. And then we talk about policy definition. Policy definition, we're going to determine rights. Policy definition, who should get access to what? And we have to set up policies for all of these things. Access control models, the formal models here, discretionary access control lists. Talks about ownership, flexible, decentralized. An access control list is if you're working on a Windows machine, for instance, and you right-click on a file in a folder, and you are the owner or you're the administrator and you give access to somebody. You give them permissions to use that resource. That's discretionary access control. We do that ourselves. Role-based is based upon the position that somebody is filling. Non-discretionary, centralized administrative control over this one because the administrators would be the ones that would set these things up. You can, in the Windows world, kind of do this by using groups. And you may make a group that maybe all of your accountants need permissions for certain things, and that would be the role-based. We'd have the accountants group, and we put them in that group. And that's the way the Windows people know that you're supposed to give access to resources anyway, but you can do that based on roles. NetWare used to actually have an object called a role, and you would have occupants of the role. So Microsoft never actually put one in Active Directory that they call role. So if you're going to use role-based, you need to set up a group concept to do that in the Microsoft world. And mandatory access controls talks about legal or labels, clearances, inflexible domains need to know. This is, all you military guys got this one. We're going to label it confidential or secret or top secret, and if top secret, we can usually see the confidential, but we're going to have need to know information on these things. And this usually implies that you got to be in a particular area in order to be able to get that information. Role-based, and then we have rule-based access control. And I'll just read you their definition. Access control is a term that can refer to any sort of access control model where access control policies are determined by system-enforced rules rather than system users, such as RBAC, and then RBAC is role-based and mandatory access control. Those would be rule-based systems. Basic authorization policies that talk about implicit deny. It's the default to refusing a request unless there is a rule allowing it. If we go, and to me, the implicit deny is something that we use in the Microsoft world, in the permissions world consistently, which means that if we have a resource and we create a group, for instance, and we put 3 users in that group, those 3 users have access to that resource. That's an explicit permission. We also have an explicit deny where we can go in and check the box that says deny. And if you do that, the only way to get rid of an explicit deny is to take it away. You can't do it with a permission. So with that group with the 3 users in it, we gave the permission to use that resource to those 3 users. Since we didn't give it to the other 1,000 users on the network, they're denied. And that's the implicit deny, the implied deny, which means if I didn't explicitly give it to you, you don't have it. Least privilege is something that you should always use, and it means that we assign users only the level of access or privilege that they need to do their job, which makes a lot of people unhappy because they want to be able to do everything in the world. But you need to really enforce the minimum privilege. And once you get the policy in place and you have the support, that's where the buy-in comes in. We talked about earlier on. You've got to have support from the top before this will work. Single sign-on, we talked about authenticate once, authorize many. In Active Directory, you get authenticated one time, and then you get access to all of your resources. Authenticate to obtain an access token, and then the token's used to authenticate to the other applications. That's the simplistic way of saying it. In Microsoft, we go through a series of tickets. You get a ticket, and then the ticket has all of your access on it, and then it's presented to the resources, which allow you to use them or not use them. Simplifies account management, but compromising an account may compromise multiple applications, which we said earlier, and is difficult to implement on public networks. This is the one that's been tried a number of ones, although I think Google's having a little more success with their accounts because they keep buying everybody. And now your Gmail account gives you access to your YouTube and to a number of other things that Google have, or Alphabet with their name change. Accounting, logging, account for the actions and detect intrusions, and you can choose what to log. Detecting intrusions can be very useful, and somebody tries to log on to the administrator account 400 times in a row and is unsuccessful, you may have an issue. You may have a bigger issue because you don't have a policy that says if you try to log on to an account, and the administrator, by the way, is exempt from the try to log on 5 times in 15 minutes and we lock the account. The administrator account never gets locked. It gets slowed down a little bit, but it doesn't get locked. So we can detect intrusions. We can account for actions. What did somebody do? Depending on how we have our logging configured and the choosing what to log. Did somebody make changes to Active Directory? Did they give some other users more information than they should have? And then we can use all of these things for surveillance. And surveillance, accounting for the physical access to the system, and it acts as a deterrent to users. And there's lots of surveillance, cameras all over the place anymore. We talk about incident reporting, and incident reporting is what happened, when it happened, who did it, what's going on with the system. What is the incident? To whom do I make a report, and how quickly should I report the incident? So with that, see, I did what they said, an hour. Understand why security policies and procedures are critical to protecting assets. Distinguish the types of security controls that can be deployed to protect assets. describe the basis of access control systems, the identification, authentication, and authorization and accounting, and the CIA and the AAA are kind of at the heart of what goes on in security. I've always thought that, and to a great deal, security is paying attention to what's going on your network or on your own personal computer. What happened? It slowed down all of a sudden. Well, golly, something did happen. Do I have the bandwidth that I should have? If you're monitoring your network, if you have a full pipe coming out at 2 o'clock in the morning, probably not something good. And I've seen that happen. We were monitoring for somebody and look 2 o'clock in the morning, go back to the records, and golly, 100% bandwidth going out. After some investigation, they found out that somebody had stored a movie on one of the servers and was using it as a download site. Configuration policies and not paying attention. How did they get there? Earlier in the day, somebody had configured an FTP port with an open FTP port so they could update something on the server and forgot to shut down the FTP port. So paying attention to what's going on and then knowing what model to use in these things. And with that, it's time for the questions. What we'll do is I'll try to give you a chance to answer the questions. Please chime in and answer these things. And then we'll take a break. What is the difference between authorization and authentication? It could take a long time if nobody answers.
Authentication is identifying who you are. Authorization is determining what you have access to once you're authenticated.
Right. What type of access control system is based on resource ownership? If I own it and I give you permission.
Will that be DAC?
Yep. Discretionary access control. That I own it and then I will give it to you. That's my discretion is the way I always thought about it. Then that's what made it discretionary. It's my discretion or your discretion to give somebody access to the resource. Okay. True or false? A need-to-know policy can only be enforced using discretionary or role-based control.
False.
False. A mandatory access control system supports the idea of domains or compartments to supplement a basic hierarchical system. What steps should be taken to enroll a new user? What's the first thing you want to know about them?
Who they are.
Who they are. The identity proofing, right? Let's see. Identity proofing and issue authentication credentials. Then the same after that, username, password, and give them permissions. What is the basis of computer security accounting? What's going to tell us that somebody did something bad to us?
I would say accountability.
Accountability. What's kind of a pain in the rear to review?
Logs.
Logs.
Yep.
So logs are, and they are a pain to review.
Yep.
But it's the thing that's going to tell you what happened. What users, they tell you what users properly authenticated and improperly authenticated. I came into work one day and our guy was so on top of that. And I had tried to log on from home because we could do that. And he said, somebody been trying to log into your account. I said, yeah, I know. I missed my password 3 times. But he had the log software set up that he could tell those kinds of things. And that's where you got to go, particularly to your administrative accounts. You have to be really careful, and it can do a lot of damage. And you have to do a lot of education, and we'll get into that later on. But we had a campus administrator, somebody sent the famous, this is IT, and tell me what your credentials are, and she did it. And that was really nasty. What term is used to describe a property of a secure network where a sender cannot deny having sent a message?
Repudiation.
Non-repudiation. How does accounting provide non-repudiation? What did we just say that accounting did?
It associates a user with an action.
Yeah, so it's in the log. All right?
Yep.
Exactly. You are implementing security controls to protect highly confidential information that must only be made available on a need-to-know basis. What class of security control should you investigate? Which one of them had the secret confidential that we talk about in those areas, in those terms?
Are you asking what type of access control?
Yeah. Yes.
It'd be mandatory then.
Correct. Okay. Let me find where I was now. You have implemented a web gateway that blocks access to social networking site, which, by the way, is not easy to do. We did that, and then they figured out you could get there with HTTPS. So then you got to go into an IPsec policy. How would you categorize this type of security control?
Well, that's another access control, right? So I would think rule-based.
Rule-based. Well, let's get broader because we had a. Let me get back here on these if I can find my mouse. Anyhow, can't find the slide I'm looking for, of course. Anyhow, it'd be a technical control is what they were looking for, but what you said is true, rule-based, rule-based sort of thing. The company you work for has suffered numerous intrusions due to poor password management by employees. Given a significant budget to mitigate the problem, what type of security control would you use?
Would be an RBOC.
Yeah, I could do that. Let's go to something like this because we got unlimited budget. We can do all those things, but if we use rules or whatever else, we're only going to have one factor. So what they're looking for here is a multi-factor authentication. Since we have, and the unlimited budget is the key on that one. Significant budget.
Yeah, to support hardware and additional software you might need.
Yep.
Yep.
Yep. Because that's where the money comes.
Could we please turn the mics off? Because we're not hearing you. We're hearing you, but you're garbled.
I hear him just fine.
Yeah, he's right. If you're not, oh well, in this one you turn it on, but yeah, if you would turn the mics off, because everybody's going to get the way these things work. Everybody's going to get a different connection, which is unfortunate, but that's just the way it is. So what is clear to somebody is going to be unclear to others. So anyhow. Okay, in this one we'll look at threats and attacks, and there is a lab, and it's got an hour set aside for it. May take some of you not as long, some of you longer, but to where you look at attacks, you put a Trojan on and then use some other tools in order to go through the back door and get on one machine to the other to see how these things work, and then go through the process of what can we do to protect from that particular type of attack. And there are a number of attacks. Some of them are easier to protect from than others. So in this one, it's going to categorize vulnerabilities and threat agents and vectors. Understand social engineering and phishing attacks. Social engineering is probably the most destructive because it's not a technical attack. It's when you talk somebody into something. Identify different types of malware and malware protection, and we have lots of malware. It's any of the bad guys stuff. So in this one, vulnerabilities, and these are what we have. Vulnerabilities, and a vulnerability is just like any other vulnerability, is a weakness that could be triggered, could be accidental or intentional. And then we have a threat, and the threat is the potential for a threat agent or a threat actor, somebody or something, to trigger a vulnerability and exploit it, or exploit it and exploit it. If it's accidental, it probably won't be an exploit. If it's intentional, there probably will be an exploit. And we have all of these vulnerabilities that we talk about in our softwares, and there are a number of vulnerabilities in them. And if you look back there's a formula for the number of errors per every 1,000 lines of code, and when you have 15 or 20 million lines of code, you're going to have some problems in the code, and that's where the vulnerabilities come from. But just because there's a vulnerability doesn't necessarily mean that there's an exploit. An exploit is the ability to use that vulnerability to do something. The risk is the likelihood that something will happen. And these, I'll go kind of simple on this. If we had a house and we had locks and alarms and so on it, but we left, and I think somebody says in one of the books somewhere, you leave a bathroom window open in the back of the house, you lock the front, deadbolt, regular lock, then you've created a vulnerability, and the vulnerability is the open bathroom window. The threat, the potential that somebody is going to do something, what is the threat? How high is the threat? If it's you're gone in the middle of the night, nobody can see this, and somebody knows about it, the threat's probably going to be relatively high. If it's in the middle of the day and the kids are playing in the backyard, or some kids are playing in the backyard or whatever, the threat goes down, the risk goes down, the likelihood that something's going to happen goes down. So we have these different things. And a control is a system or procedure put in place to mitigate the risks. And the likelihood, the risk here, we may have checklists or things like that. I'm kind of a simpleton and I like pictures. So the vulnerability here, the risk is stolen rims, stolen car, stolen whatever. The loss of the rims is the threat, and the exploit is to go through the hole in the fence, and the hole in the fence is going to be the vulnerability. And the thief here is going to be the threat agent, and the rims are going to be the asset, all the kind of the things that we've talked about, but maybe in a little bit simpler term. Types of threat agents. We have hackers and crackers. We talked about that a little bit earlier. Hackers are generally going to be the good guys. Hackers are somebody that have knowledge and want to share knowledge. Sometimes hackers get a little over exuberant and do things that they shouldn't. Crackers, criminal hackers, they're usually out to be no good, for no good. And then white hats, black hats, and script kiddies. White hats are going to be the hackers, the good guys. Ethical hackers are generally going to be white hats. So one that they don't put up here, there's also a gray hat. A gray hat sometimes on one side and sometimes on the other side. And then we have black hats. Black hats are the bad guys. They're malicious hackers. And then script kiddies go to an internet site, get something, and just run it against something else. They have relatively little knowledge, and they use hacker tools without a lot of understanding of what goes on. We're going to have external threats and internal threats, and we have the external threats here. Agents and motivations, and I think that I put, let's look at this one here. So the types of hackers and what are their motivations and skill levels. A hacker has a high skill level, and then his motivations to improve security, and a cracker is high, and he has a motivation to harm the system. Script kiddies, a low skill level, and they want to gain recognition. Then we have spies, high, earn money. Employees, and those are going to be not external, but those are going to be the internal hackers, and their skill level is going to vary and their motivation is going to vary when we do these things. Hacktivists, hack for a cause. Their skill level varies and their purpose is to promote a cause. And then we have our cyber terrorists, that's high, and theirs is to support an ideology. So we have the external threats, the agents, and the motivations we talked about. A threat could be accidental or it could be malicious, structured or unstructured. Accidental means that somebody didn't mean to do it, but they did it. Somebody deleted a whole half of your server's database, but they didn't really mean to. But if it's a malicious attack, they intended to delete that. Structured and unstructured. A structured attack is somebody sits out and maps out a way to get into your system. An unstructured attack is kind of an opportunity, an attack of opportunity. Just they kind of stumbled over it. So we have all sorts of threats, all sorts of things that we need to protect from. The one that's probably pretty dangerous because we spend a lot of time and effort talking about how to protect our networks from the outside. But a high percentage, and I think somewhere at 80% of the attacks actually come from insiders. An insider may have had or has now authorized access to a resource that they attack. And these guys include employees, contractors, partners. Contractors get access to the resources. Partners get access to your resource. And the purpose, sabotage, financial gain, business advantage, different motivations for what they do with these things. We can have accidental threats. People make mistakes, careless. The one I told you about where they accidentally left the open FTP port. That was an accidental, that was a structured attack that found it. It was accidental in creating the vulnerability. So we can have accidental, naive users, all sorts of things. Environmental we show here could be natural disaster. Environmental could be environmental controls go down. Could be earthquakes, floods, tornadoes, all those things that we don't really think about in a lot of cases as far as security, but they are part of security because they're going to damage our data. They're going to damage our equipment. And then we have legal and commercial threats for these things. This is right out of the book. Legal and commercial threats The threats to assets and staff members of an organization can be made vulnerable because of the misuse of equipment by its employees or attackers. Some examples include downloading and distributing obscene material, defamatory comments published on social network sites, hijacked mail, third-party liability for theft or damage of personal data, accounting and regulatory liability to preserve accurate records. If somebody does this defamatory comments or threatens somebody on a social network site, the company may be liable for that. So you really have to be careful what kind of authority that you actually give your users. What can they do? What resources can they access? Social engineering is talking somebody into something, basically. It can be, and it's impersonation. You call up IT, this is the director of HR, and I need my password reset right now, and this is the one I wanted to use or reset my password. So we're going to dominate or charm targets into revealing information or providing access. And I had a CO one time, and people want to help people. They always want to be helpful. It's just the way we are generally. But if he really wanted something, he would call up a command and ask to speak to the second in command. I don't really want to bother the CO of your command. Maybe you can help me. Another way of social engineering is you create a situation that you go solve for the individual to gain their trust, and that's one of the really important aspects of this is to gain trust. And the only way to prevent social engineering is training, and you have to have strict policies. This is what you can and can't do. This is what you can and can't share, those kinds of things. Exploit weak authentication over the telephone, instant messaging and email. Again, the big deal here is you have to establish trust. The reason for the effectiveness is familiarity or liking. Consensus or social proof that why won't you do this? The social proof itself. Authority and intimidation, do it for me right now or I'm going to fire you. Scarcity or urgency, this is the thing that car salesmen use a lot. We only have one and the offer is only good for the next 15 minutes. So scarcity of resource. Create a false sense of scarcity or urgency so that we can get somebody to do what we want them to do. Other ones, dumpster diving, and dumpster diving, real dumpster diving is still being done. People get an awful lot out of paper records still, but this is electronic dumpster diving for information. And what we do here is we're going to build trust. Being convincing depends on the attacker obtaining privileged information about the organization. And one of the things about the information, hackers, crackers, people that attack you don't do this in an afternoon. Big news was car got hacked earlier this year or late last year. Those guys worked over a year on that hack. So this is something that dumpster diving for information, going to piece together the information about the company a little bit at a time. An organizational chart. What is the network set up? How are the routers set up? Is it broken up inside different routers, different collision or different broadcast domains? So shoulder surfing is just that, somebody watching over your shoulder and watching you type in your password. It doesn't actually have to be that. It could be from a distance. It could have something that amplifies it. Pictures, could have a camera in the area, and that's what a little story here recently about people stealing information from debit cards, and you have to have the pin. What they do is they put the skimmer in the slide and get the information off of the magnetic strip, and then they have a little camera by the side that will take a video of you typing in your PIN. So those sorts of things. The lunchtime attack is if your policies are set up right and your technical policies are set up right so that after you leave your computer and you forgot to lock it, it automatically locks after 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, whatever else. But the lunchtime attack is counting on the fact that people leave their machines at lunchtime and leave them on and logged in. Tailgating I talked about a little bit earlier, and this is this is tailgating over here. Let me see if I can get make some bad marks here. But here, somebody goes in the door, and this guy is going to go in right after him here, not closing. So we have somebody with the proper authentication and somebody without the proper authentication. The other way is stand at the door with a bunch of packages, get a UPS uniform, people will let you in. People want to be nice. One of the ways to stop tailgating is in a man trap here, where you have a door and then an area inside, and commercial buildings have those. They have an exterior door and an interior door and an airspace in the middle. They had one here not long ago where a bank robbery actually got stopped by that. They got through the outside door, but the inside doors were locked, so they couldn't get into the bank. They said that they actually saw them coming, but they did stop them by locking the inner doors and not locking the outer doors. So this is a way to get people in, and any of you remember Get Smart, that's exactly what happened to him. He got trapped in the man trap and can get out. Phishing, we've heard this before many times. We have phishing, and now we have spear phishing, whaling. That's on down there a little bit farther, but use spoofed communications to trick a user into providing confidential information. They're going to spoof something, try to get you to change your credentials. They'll make a website that looks really close to whatever it is. Of course, my favorite is I get these phishing attacks that tell me that I need to update my account from a bank that I don't have an account on. But they're taking their chances on these all the time. So they're going to send you something, click on it, and hopefully you can put in your credentials. And spoof emails are faked or hacked websites in order to do these things. And it's not that difficult to download a website. There's a number of softwares out there that you can go download something to look exactly like Bank of America or whatever else they're going after. In my case, I don't remember the name of the bank, but anyhow, we have that. Spoofed emails, faked or hacked websites. Hacked websites, we're going to put something on to collect the credentials, and that's the objective of all these things. They want to get your credentials. Not necessarily or all the time to get into that account, but they're counting on the fact that you may have reused that password. Golly, none of us ever did that, did we? But that's the risk of reusing passwords. The reason we change passwords is so that if they get it and if it's encrypted, then by the time they've cracked the password, we've changed it and moved on, so it's no longer valid. Then we have vishing, which is the same thing over voice over IP phone phishing or internet messenger. Spear phishing is when you target individuals, and spear phishing is where a lot of phishing is going now because it's more effective to go after an individual instead of going after a whole group of users. And whaling is when you go after a senior management, somebody that may be able to give you a lot of information when you go through these things. And some of the stuff out there, the phishing email may show that they know your name, job title, telephone number, all the things. When we go up here, spoof messages, not spoof messages, but when we go into the dumpster diving here, all of these things that we got little bits of information that didn't seem to be destructive at all, but when you put them all together, you can get a bigger picture. And and then use other tools in order to do that. A watering hole is a compromised third-party site where you might use a probability that the group may use an unsecured third-party website. And these, they talk about something like a pizza delivery firm or something like that. Staff going off-site to do those things. And then they install malware on the computers as you go through those sites. There are lots of sophisticated attacks that you can get malware simply by going to the site or rolling your mouse over a particular area. You don't have to click on anything necessarily. In these emails, you generally are going to have to click on something. Social engineering, and again, what makes it effective: authority, somebody in authority or pretending to be an authority. Intimidation, the consensus or social proof. The consensus is everybody else is doing it. Scarcity, urgency, familiarity, liking, and trust. And I think one of the big things here is trust. Developing the trust so that the user doesn't think twice about giving you information. What makes attacks ineffective? Policies, standard procedures, and policies that people obey. Educating and training, and I think we probably don't do that very well. In many organizations, we're always too busy to train. Accounting, auditing and surveillance, auditing the logs, maybe closed circuit cameras that you monitor your organization with, or at least specific areas of the organization. What are you going to do with unoccupied spaces? What are you going to do with unused ports? Those kinds of, these are all things that will come a little bit later on, but those are all areas that can affect these things. And then malware, viruses, a virus has to have a host. It depends on an executable. Executable script, a macro, a boot sector, a number of different viruses, and a virus has a payload. Worms, on the other hand, are self-propagating. They don't need the host. Typically, a worm's going to consume some bandwidth while it is propagating. And it may be able to compromise an application or whatever else. And then we have logic bombs and fork bombs. Logic bombs, these are things that are set to install a virus based on the time of day, day of the week. They had the Michelangelo virus not too many years ago that was supposed to set to detonate on Michelangelo's birthday. And then fork bombs, and what these things do is, and this is a little representation, you get one and then they spawn other ones, and then they fork and they keep going and keep going and going and going. Hoaxes can be as destructive as anything else. For one thing, they can tie up a lot of email server resource, because generally what they'll do is say, you need to do this, and then tell all your friends, everybody in your address book. So you send it to everybody, not you guys, but people, users send it to everybody in their address book. So we have a lot of email processing that we really shouldn't have to do but are doing. Unnecessary support calls, and you use vendor sites to identify malware, the McAfees and the Sophoses of the world when we go through these things. A lot of times these things will tell you to go do things that can be destructive. Go delete this or delete that. Hopefully it's something that'll be protected and you can't delete it, and that's what happens with a lot of these things. But hoaxes can be destructive too, and the antivirus vendors of the world will generally know which are hoaxes. They know which are real. They may not have a definition yet, and that's the thing that becomes dangerous, and the zero-day vulnerabilities are the ones that are really dangerous, the ones that haven't been discovered yet. And then we have malware, spam or spit. Spits delivered in the telephone or internet messenger spam over the voice over IP. Unsolicited email can be a vector for malware. We may get malware in it. It may just be an annoyance. But in any case, in the business, it costs because users, instead of doing their job, are deleting emails that they didn't ask for about products that they don't want. So when we do those things, spam is an issue. I had a friend not long ago went to a new job, and they didn't have a spam filter at the front end. When he put on one, he estimated that about 80% of his email at that time was spam. So once he got that under control, it never got delivered to the server, and when it didn't get delivered to the server, it never got delivered to the individual. So it helped with the company quite a bit. Trojans and spywares, Trojans and botnets. A Trojan is like the Trojan horse. It's something that appears to be one thing, but actually is something else. And in the lab, you're going to go through and look and do a lab about Trojan and then what the Trojan can do for you. But it's a malicious program concealed within a benign one. We might make somebody send you, hey, try out this new game, and you open it up. The game plays, but in the background, a piece of spyware or a virus of some sort gets installed on the machine. Now, a lot of that depends upon how you have your computers configured, how you have your antivirus configured, what user you are, how you have the user access control configured on the newer versions of Windows. In the old versions in XP, everybody wanted to be administrators, and that was a great way because it didn't tell you if you were installing something. That was a great way to get infected, is to run the system as an administrator. Keep in mind that if you're running this as a user that doesn't have the authority to install things, a regular user, you're probably going to have a whole lot more trouble getting these diseases than if you're running with higher authority. That means don't be a clicky. When something pops up, don't just click, okay, see what it says. What are you about to install? Did you start an installation, or did you just come out of nowhere? The Trojans designed for covert surveillance or control of an infected host, and that's where the bots come in, the botnets that we're going to be used to attack us or attack others. And then backdoors, one of the things that we may want to do with this Trojan is create a backdoor, and the one that you're going to do in the lab is going to it actually installs a piece of software called Netcat, and Netcat creates a hole through your firewall going out, because in this one they had a script to actually do that. But generally everything can get out of a network and nothing can get in. So if we allow these things to go out, they can create backdoors and punch a hole automatically in the firewall and allow somebody to connect from outside. It's occasionally a good opinion that you scan your own network to see if there are any odd ports open. Spyware allows the attacker to record the system configuration, user actions. A lot of times what they're interested in the spyware is spying on you, so that, well, now spyware, yeah, they're doing that. I'm getting spyware and adware. Key logging, screenshots, remote logging, those sorts of things, so that we can, in spyware, spy on us and get information about the machine. The adware sometimes is dangerous and sometimes really isn't. Records user activity, but less than spyware, what websites you go to, what kind of things do you look at, so they know how to send you targeted ads. Uses the cookies to deliver the advertisements based on your browsing behavior. Legitimate adware should make privacy policy obvious that they're putting it on. Right? They're probably not going to tell you that. Privacy policies are getting to be kind of a big deal. Other things we have are rootkits. Rootkits are particularly dangerous. They're very, very difficult to detect. Sony got in a bunch of trouble a few years ago because they installed rootkits for you. And they installed a rootkit to keep you from making copies of the CDs that you bought. So that once you installed it, the rootkit prevented you from making a copy. What it does is replace system files and utilities so that it looks like the system is running correctly, but what you're really running is the rootkit file and not the real one. And there's Windows has got systems set up that you can check to be sure that the system files are really the system files. You can scan your machines to do that. Most powerful to operate with system or kernel level privileges. In the world of computers, we have user level and kernel level, and we have rings of authority originally in these things. And the thing that's closest to the kernel is one that's going to have the most authority. User privileges are going to have the least authority. So if the rootkit can get kernel authority, machine authority, system authority, then it's going to be a whole lot more dangerous. And then we have ransomware, which has been around for a while, although it's not been around as long as a lot of the other stuff. They say nuisance. It's not necessarily a nuisance. Some of these things, you can lock it out. It may be a simple one. Replaces it with does a shell replacement. Those can be overcome, but the serious ones now encrypt your data. And once they encrypt your data, they own the private key, and you can't decrypt it without the key. And so you send them the whatever, $35, $45, $150, whatever, and they'll decrypt your data for you. A way around that, not necessarily a good way around that, but a way around that is don't use the NTFS file system. But then you don't have any sort of security on the file system if you do that. The FAT file system can't be encrypted on the FAT file system. It has to be NTFS in order to do that. I think one of the issues here is, or one of the things here is have backups, regular backups that you create so that if this does happen to you, you can restore your data. And that's what they're going after, is encrypting your data typically. So again, backups become a big deal on the system. Preventing malware backups, apply OS application patches. Apply patches to the operating system and to the applications. One of the things, and I say one of the things a lot, but when a patch comes out, the black hat guys, the malicious hackers, are going to look for unpatched systems. The reason they're going to look for unpatched systems is now they have an in, because they reverse engineer the patch to see what it actually fixed. So a system is more dangerous right after the patch comes out if it hadn't been applied than it was before. And then malware protection, the malware antivirus softwares, and they have to be updated regularly. In my opinion, and this is just my opinion, you should say all this stuff for auto update. The risk today of it damaging something on a machine, on a server with proprietary software, a different situation, because you don't know if it's going to affect your proprietary software. If you're running a system, a Windows system with Office and the Microsoft stuff, it's probably not going to really affect that. And you need to update the Office stuff too, because it has holes in it, as you see on a regular basis. All of the softwares, when the updates come out, you should put them on because they can be reverse engineered. Restrict system privileges, and that goes back to the least privilege. Only give users the authority that they need to do their job, no more, no less. If you give them less, they can't do their job. If you give them more, they can do a whole lot of, may be able to do damage to you. Are they going to complain? Absolutely. An example here, a place I was working, a school, a group of, and it was nurses, came and come to the network administrator and complained that they couldn't install the softwares that they need to try them out for their classes. And he gave them administrative authority so that they could install the softwares. And then they wound up installing a bunch of viruses and a bunch of toolbars and all sorts of things, spyware, malware on the system. Eventually had to take it away, say, if you really need these things, let me know and I'll install it for you. But restrict privileges. That's one of the things, again, it's not going to make people happy, but it's going to make the network secure. Network administrators are not necessarily the most popular people in the organization. The other one's educate users. Don't click on stuff. If you get, and even today, if you get an email that says it's from somebody that you know, check to be sure, because you can make an email appear to come from somebody else. So you need to educate users. Don't, if you get something you don't expect, don't do anything with it. Let the IT folks check it out. Audit and continuous monitoring. Audit, again, not the most fun thing in the world, but it's something that needs to be done. Continuous monitoring, a number of tools are available, some pay, some free, that allow you to monitor what's going on the network, what's going on the machines. Auditing, what more can you say? You've got to do the log audit. No fun, but it's got to be done. And then keep up to date with the threats. You need to have some probably subscriptions to some sites that do those things. The antivirus software, sans.org, for instance, has lots of good information there, and much of it's free. Some of it's not, but much of it is free. Antivirus software, the database of the virus signatures that we want to do heuristic, which is it's a learning process. Malware, can remove it or quarantine it. How are we going to do that? Is antivirus resistance, the stealth viruses that it hides, modification, viruses modify themselves, they armor, the retroviruses. Slower sparse infectors go slowly so that they don't key the antivirus softwares. And the metamorphic, these morph, they actually change what they are when the antivirus software starts. The retrovirus tries to disable the antivirus, and some of them are very good at that. Armor, the code's protected. The modification, the antivirus softwares have signatures, which means that they're looking for specific patterns in files, and what the modification does is it changes that so that the antivirus won't recognize it as a virus. Metamorphic kind of does the same thing. It morphs into something different. It's different every time. It looks like something different every time anything happens to it. You need to run these things. You need to have them set up for automatic scanning so that if you get a file, try to download a file that has a virus in it, it will say no. You really don't want to do that. It happens to everybody. You go to places, it looks legitimate, and it winds up not being legitimate. Most antiviruses today protect against malware, and what I found out about Microsoft Defender is that I couldn't run my adware program with it. One would disable the other. So if you have multiple, be sure that one's not disabling the other when you do those things. Tools may be used against specific web threats, anti-spyware, anti-spam, pop-up blockers, all of those things. Pop-ups frequently are maybe an annoyance, and they may be something that actually is a threat to installing something on the system. The antivirus software can automatically clean, quarantine these things. It can delete the host file or restore it from backup is what we want to do with these things. Keep in mind that we said that a virus needs an executable, and typically when it installs a virus, it's either going to be in your startup program or make a registry key so that it starts the virus whenever the computer starts. If the file's still on the machine and it doesn't run, you don't really want it there, but it's not doing the damage that it was in the past. Vendor knowledge bases, sometimes you have to have a special, or they'll provide a special file in order to get rid of a virus, particularly those that are particularly invasive. So you have to use those things. You may have to boot from a flash drive or something like that. You can't boot from floppies anymore because they don't put them on them. But it may be a small program that you boot. Sometimes these things can't be removed with Windows running. Windows will lock them down because you can't generally delete a Windows from a Windows machine a file that's in use. So you may have to boot from some sort of a boot media and not have Windows running in order to get the file off of the system. Some rootkits may force a reformat in an OS install. There are softwares that will look for rootkits, and they may or may not be able to clean the rootkit. You may have to reinstall the whole thing. They're pretty much insidious. They're pretty bad when you get to these things. So the review, categorize vulnerabilities, threat agents, and vectors, understand social engineering and phishing attacks, and I think we've all at least seen phishing attacks. Some of you have seen social engineering. Identify different types of malware and malware protection. So, time to do the questions at the end of the chapter. What is a lunchtime attack?
That when someone leave their computer open?
Yep. User's account can be compromised by anyone able to physically access the workstation. And I think honestly, I mean, it's there, and that's one of the things that they'll ask about, and it's real, but I think that that's becoming less of an issue because administrators are getting a lot smarter about a policy that you have a password protected screensaver that starts after a short period of time if somebody walks away from the machine, and people do, they walk away from it. They don't mean to. You don't even think about it. Thinking about lunch. When considering accidental threats, what important distinctions can be made to identify different threat sources? No takers? What are those kind of attacks that we could have? Got going the wrong way, huh? PowerPoint stopped working. PowerPoint got mad at me.
Can you rephrase the question?
I'll try. Okay, it's not accidental, so it's an intentional attack. What kind of different drivers do we have?
Social engineering?
Social engineering, what about, I mean, what's the motive? Is it structure, unstructured? Is it accidental on purpose? Internal, external? Those kinds of things. And those are all different areas that you have to protect from. And they're not always going to be the easiest thing. And it's not always going to be the easiest thing to do that. The external threats, we do a pretty good job because firewalls and you close all the ports and you maybe use a proxy server so that people can't go everywhere they want anytime they want. But the internal threats, you got a lot more ports open. I've done scans on servers on the inside and scans from the outside, and boy, it's a lot of difference for what's there. Users internal may have more permissions than you know about that they got way back where sometime, and you're 3 network administrators later and you don't know that they got that. So all those things, internal, external, structured, unstructured, what's the motivation, and the attackers, hackers, crackers, script kiddies, those sorts of things. Apart from natural disaster, what type of events threaten physical damage to assets?
You can have a power outage, so it affects the environmental controls.
Yep.
It can also impact potentially physical security measures you have in place. Like if you have electronic doors, things like that, that lose power, then they just open automatically.
Yeah. All you military guys, what was your job in the military? Your big job in the military?
Message traffic, making sure people didn't go into my compartmental spaces that didn't have access to it.
Let's get bigger. Get some big guns on those ships and some big bombs on those airplanes.
Making sure nobody can actually get into my network and find out what technology we have.
Well, that's it. But what about terrorism and war?
That's inevitable.
Yeah, but those are some of the things that can damage it. Now, I don't know how you set up a continuity of business plan for that, but that's one of the things. Accidental damage, vandalism, war, and vandalism I got from the other stuff you guys were talking about.
You'd have to have a TSSI clearance, to talk about what I was talking about.
I had that. We talk about data. I had an interesting thing happen to me on an SBI bring up one time. A guy came in and questioned me, and then he came back the next morning, closed all the doors, and said, "Were you ever in the Air Force?" No. Well, somebody with close to my name had robbed an exchange in Germany, and they got that put into the Air Force database under my Social Security number. So anyhow, what distinguishes a rootkit from other types of Trojan? They're particularly insidious. There you go. What are rootkits?
They're also harder to detect.
Much harder to detect. They replace system files, and that's what makes them much harder to detect, because it looks like the proper file is running, but it's not. It's the rootkit file, and it substitutes itself for those things. True or false? All backdoors are created by malware such as rootkits.
False.
False. What technique do viruses use to avoid detection by antivirus software? There we go.
A stealth.
Stealth. Polymorphic. Disable the retrovirus. Disable the antivirus. That's the really, and they do that. That's the clever one. That's why a lot of these, or at least they used to, I don't know if they do anymore. The first thing that after you install the software, it would reboot the system and would actually do a scan, would run the antivirus and do a scan before Windows started, because then the quote software unquote wasn't really running and it couldn't disable the antivirus when you do those things. How do social engineering attacks succeed?
By phishing.
By phishing, well, social engineering. What does it depend upon? Now, phishing can be a social engineering attack. I agree with you on that. Well, what other things?
Education and training.
Education training. What about
Policy and procedures, accounting.
policy procedures? This is a CEO. Change my password right now.
Don't care.
Don't care, yeah. Authority, intimidation, those kinds of things. I'm going to fire you.
Okay, I clicked unemployment. I'm good.
And unemployment not as good as it sounds. But all of those things, it uses trust, familiarity, urgency, scarcity, consensus, intimidation, authority in order to do those things. And social engineering really rides on people wanting to help and trusting people and liking people.
Well, I get phished daily. Like my last name, I created it, but I've got a long lost uncle in Zimbabwe that's got $4.6 billion for me.
Oh, you do? Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Great. That's
Only need
great.
my checking account information.
Yeah. It's amazing, all that stuff. Let me know when you get it. What is shoulder surfing?
To find somebody's password and everything by looking over their shoulder.
Yeah. Or recording it or something like that, yes. Questions? You take a break, and after the break, and I will monitor, I always turn off my mic so you can't hear the background noise here, but after that, do lab 1 and 2. We didn't do lab 1, it's a little short one on how to use the virtual machines. And then lab 2 is actually Trojans and firewalls. We'll do some configuration on that. And you actually make a Windows policy on making things work. So with that, take a break. I said I'll be here until class ends tonight. If you have any questions, ask. And it's lab time for the rest of the night. And you guys know, I understand. Is it true that you got to do all the labs before they'll let you take the test?
Yes.
They do work. I mean, the labs generally reinforce the objectives that they're talking about on these things.